When you have questions, you go to the boss. You ask the boss the questions. You wait for the boss to tell you what it is. Okay? So we asked the boss, what's going on?
New York, she come by our office last week to discuss some of these issues. I would ask something I imagine most of my colleagues are not asking, which is the relationship between immigration, particularly extremely high illegal immigration levels under the Biden administration, and the persistence of the inflation problem. And I recognize this is not your policy focus, but you are the Federal Reserve Chairman. So I just want to get your views on this. And in particular, I would read you a quote from Mickey Bowman, who's one of your governors. And this says, and a quote, there's a risk that increased immigration and continued labor market tightness could lead to persistently high core services inflation. Given the current low inventory of affordable housing, the inflow of new immigrants in some geographic areas could result in upward pressure on rents as additional housing supply may take time to materialize. With labor markets remaining tight, wage growth has been elevated at around or above 4%, still higher than the pace consistent with our 2% inflation goal, given trend productivity growth. The Bank of England, I believe, produced a recent report on this issue in the United Kingdom, obviously a different economy in a different country. But what do you see as the relationship, in particular, given that housing is such a big driver of the inflation that we've seen over the last few years? As Senator Haggerty said, the highest in 40 years. What role do you see illegal immigration playing in driving up housing costs, which, of course, is a main driver of inflation for American citizens?
Let me quickly start by echoing your first comment, which is we don't comment on immigration policy, but we do comment on inflation. So I would say this:
Safe.
many people came into the country over the last couple of years, many of them through asylum requests, and went to work. Labor supply increased a great deal. It's not. There's no clear answer, but my sense is that in the long run, immigration is kind of neutral on inflation. In the short run, it may actually have helped because the labor market got looser because there were more people. But you're talking about housing specifically. There will be, I'm sure there are places in the country where new people coming into the country, I'm sure you can find places and they exist where that will have contributed to an already tight housing market. But overall, in terms of the aggregate inflation, I wouldn't say it's a driver one way or the other.
So I want to follow up on that thread, but just on that topic of particular areas that have been affected, Chairman Brown, I'd like to ask unanimous consent to submit a letter for the record from the city of Springfield in our state, the southwestern part of our state, which I think highlights a very real example of this particular concern, straight from the horse's mouth itself. Now, this letter, I want to quote from it. Springfield has seen a surge in population through immigration that has significantly impacted our ability as a community to produce enough housing opportunities for all. Springfield's Haitian population has increased 15 to 20,000 over the last 4 years in a community of under 60,000 previous residents, putting a significant strain on our resources and ability to provide ample housing for all of our residents. And end quote there. And my
Objection. So
thank you. In my conversations with folks in Springfield, it's not just housing. They're trying to build 5,000 new housing units, which is a very Herculean task in a town of about 55,000 people. But it's also hospital services, it's school services, there are a whole host of ways in which this immigration problem, I think, is having very real human consequences. But I'm going to go back to just one other question, Chair Powell, on this immigration and labor supply question. So one of the euphemistic ways in which economists, I think, sometimes talk about labor supply and immigration is they'll say something to the effect of, well, an increase in labor supply has put downward pressure on labor prices. And what they're effectively saying is that increased immigration has put downward pressure on the wages of American workers. I wonder, when you hear sort of your colleagues and other economists outside of the Fed talk about the influx of immigration and the fact that it, I think, admittedly has put downward pressure on wages. Okay, so obviously that has put some downward pressure on inflation, but it also puts downward pressure on the wages that people earn to pay for their families. Why do we see that as a good thing? Or maybe that's wrong. Maybe the premise is fundamentally incorrect, but why do so many economists treat an influx of new labor as a good thing If labor is constrained, labor supply is constrained, doesn't that lead to rising wages for American workers?
So I'm not certainly not trying to put a value judgment on it. I will say that this is all happening over the last couple of years in a context of an extremely tight labor market. Now a little bit less tight, significantly less tight, but you've got a worker shortage. You've got businesses who have jobs that are open. You have,
There's too much crime.
more than one job opening for every
Too much
unemployed
regulation.
person. So you've got a very tight labor market, and it's addressing that. And we're having wage increases are still very high, but they're coming down to a more sustainable level.
Fair. And Mr. Chair, I know I'm over time. Could I just one more question on this? Thank you. I understand your point, Chair Powell. And again, I'm not ascribing value judgments to you, but if we say we have a really tight labor market and we say that there are more than one job openings per worker, there are two ways you could plausibly solve that, probably more than that, but two obvious ways you could plausibly solve that. One is through a new influx of workers via the immigration system. Another way is by raising wages and bringing some of the workers that are on the sidelines. I think specifically of the 7 million prime age men that have dropped out of the labor force. Like, why isn't that more the focus of policymakers rather than, you see a labor shortage, rather than bringing in a large number of new immigrants, why not try to boost wages in a way that brings some of those workers off the sidelines? That seems to be a much better focus from my perspective.
Certainly, that's a very constructive focus. I would agree. It's not, I don't think it has to be one or the other.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Senator Van Hollen from Maryland's record.
All right, look. So we all know prices are expensive. We have over 10 million. It's well over 10 million people in the country. We're not prepared for that. If you go look around the asylum cities, and I'm not trying to be mean, but it ain't right. Like, we are not looking at the ones that live here the way we looking at the ones that just came here. And why did they just come? Gas is expensive, milk is expensive, everything is expensive. And when you go into a place, an establishment, and you get service, are you happy? It don't even feel like people have a big standard of trying to just, work on. That's just my take.